Welcome, everybody. My name is Hanna, and I'm a faculty member here at the Harvard Center for International Development. I'm your moderator for today's session. The Harvard Center for International Development is a research center that works across the university with a global network of researchers and practitioners. CID deploys breakthrough research that addresses the world's most pressing questions. At CID, we believe that together we could develop and implement policies that help everybody reach their full potential. The new CID Spotlight Series on the future of U.S. foreign aid seeks to provide insights into the role of foreign aid agencies through conversations with leaders that have had firsthand experience in directing aid initiatives, shaping policy, and addressing development challenges. Now, as you all know, we're having this conversation at a very defining moment. Just weeks ago, the government announced a freeze on U.S. aid funding, sending shockwaves through the international development community. With US aid cuts and similar moves by the UK, by Germany, by France, the future of foreign aid is really uncertain. So today we want to go a little beyond the political debates and try to have a conversation about the key questions about the effectiveness of international assistance, a debate that's existed for decades and is really in the spotlight because of all the political moves today. Now, we've got on one hand critics citing inefficiency of aid, dependency of aid, and geopolitical motives for aid. On the other hand, others highlight really life-saving interventions and economic stability. So this leads us to today's panel and the questions that we're going to really be thinking about today. Should we rethink how aid is structured, delivered, and evaluated? Should the focus shift towards development finance, private sector engagement, and blended capital? Or should we try to focus on human capital, health, education, humanitarian? Or should we do a mix of both? What is the role and evidence in this debate? Now, to really unpack these questions, I'm so excited because we are joined by two incredible experts who have helped shape and assess foreign aid effectiveness. The first is Bård Solhjell, who's the Director General of Norad since 2020, leading Norway's international development efforts with a focus on evidence-based aid and climate finance. Previously, he served as the Secretary General of WWF Norway and held senior roles in Norwegian politics, including the Minister of Education, Minister of Environment, and Member of Parliament. Our second panelist today is Alexia Latortue, who is the former Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the U.S. Treasury, with extensive experience in development finance, private sector engagement, and global aid policy. She's held leadership roles at MCC, EBRD, and the World Bank, shaping international finance strategies across multiple regions. So I wanted to first say thank you both for being here today, and thank you everybody in the audience for being here today with us. I know everybody's really eager to hear from you guys rather than me, so I'm just gonna jump into it and start with a question for you, Alexia. You know, before we dive into a lot of the challenges around delivering aid on a lot of these debates, I thought it's important to first start by recognizing some of the positive aspects of foreign aid as well. What are the key successes we've seen? Where has aid truly made a difference? And so I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you so much, Rema. So good to be with you and also with Bård. I've collaborated with him a lot in the past. And, I think, as you said, this is a live debate. We've always been talking about, does aid work? Does it not work? But this moment in time makes the conversation even more important. So thank you to CID for having this series. There are lots of examples that I could provide. There's some really big ones, but I thought I would share three specific ones. And I'll start with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is a fantastic example of international assistance working, right? So after the end of World War II, between around 1947 and 1951, we saw between 13 to $17 billion being sent to about 16 European countries from the United States to help rebuild war-torn Europe, to help promote democracy and stem the spread of communism, and to help create trade links. And I think I want to come back to this later. That was an important, actually specific objective of the Marshall Plan, was this trade agenda. And of course, this was something that I think the results are pretty clear, really helped European countries. You still find European people, thanking the United States for that investment. And it was good for the United States too. It opened up markets. It created reliable trading partners. US companies were involved in the reconstruction of Europe as well. That's example number one. And example number two is closer in time and something that I worked on, which is a program called the graduation program informally that really targeted the poorest people. So focusing on people that were living at the time under $1.25 a day and trying to figure out how to have a less lasting positive impact on their well-being and also on their sustainable self-employment. This program had a series of sequenced interventions. So it was quite comprehensive, including a transfer of a productive asset, could be a cow, could be a sewing machine, a consumption support, so people had enough to eat. The concept was you can't plan and invest in your future if you're actually hungry. It included training, support, coaching, life skills, and in many instances also included access to a savings account and health services. The idea was to do this not just in one context, but in several contexts. So there were pilots in 6 countries, 2 in Africa, Ghana and Ethiopia, 2 in Asia, Pakistan and India, and 2 in Latin America, Honduras and Peru. And embedded in these pilots were randomized control trials. So very rigorous ways to sort of try and understand, is this effective? Long story short, there were evaluations done 1 year after the end of the program, and 3 years after that transfer of that productive asset that I mentioned. And after 1 year, it showed that on 10 indicators that were defined that included things like increased income, food consumption, women's empowerment, there were statistically important improvements for the group that received this treatment versus the control group that did not receive these interventions. And 3 years after the end of after the transfer of the productive assets, on 8 of the 10 indicators, there were statistically important improvements in 5 of the 6 sites. So pretty powerful work that was documented by Nobel Prize winners that shows success in a very targeted intervention. The last example I want to give is IDA, the International Development Association, the concessional arm of the World Bank Group that focuses on the 78 poorest countries in the world. It provides either pure grants or very concessional, very cheap finance over very long tenures, 30 years or even more, and really is designed to be hyper aligned to governments, countries' national development priorities, works through local systems, provides most of the funding on budget. So again, as part of the government budget, and has a very, very keen focus on results and accountability. And just to sort of cut the story short, 35 countries have graduated from IDA, so no longer need this kind of financing. And some of those countries have even become donor countries, providing funding to support other countries like Chile, like India, like South Korea, like China. So these are 3 examples, but I'm very aware that someone else could sit here and provide 3 other examples of what has not worked. And so I want to quickly draw some lessons from these 3 examples. Number 1, big, bold, clear goals. Number 2, alignment with the country and what the country is trying to do. Number 3, a systems or comprehensive approach. So not a sort of micro little project, but really trying to think about an ecosystem of what is needed to achieve the big, bold goal.
Thank you. No, I'm going to add, and I think all of those programs as well, in addition to those 4 aspects, have all been rigorously evaluated. There's a lot of transparency and there's a lot of data and evidence in the background. The graduation program you mentioned, I think I even saw recently a study from India 10 years out. You still see huge impacts on those who got the intervention 10 years earlier in terms of their graduation out of poverty. It's pretty stunning. Bård, I'm going to turn it over to you as well and ask the same question. What are the key successes you've seen of how international aid can work?
So thank you, Rema, and thanks also to CID for hosting me on this webinar. I was with you. I visited you a year or 2 ago. Amazing institution, and also great to see you both again, Rema and Alexia. So, Alexia's examples were great, and one of them was even on my list. So maybe I'll turn to, the greatest success for me is to watch the immense social and economic progress the world has made, and especially developing countries, the last few generations. And I think it's worth noticing because I meet many people kind of just think that countries remain poor. Now, the opposite is actually true. If you go back to the 50s, a big majority of the world's population were extremely poor by today's standards. Today, it's approximately 10% or less than 10%. Education, electricity was once, luxury goods. Now it's widespread. Child mortality is halved in just 20 years, to a large degree because of global health progress. And of course, this is due to many things, technology, economic growth, and so on. But I would say that we have a pretty solid base today to say that development assistance has been helpful in this. For instance, we know that on average, development assistance has helped economic growth, and we have more specific evidence, especially on human capital, things like sexual and reproductive health and rights, global health education, where we know that aid has been really important, an important driver of this success. And like Alexia pointed to, which is essential, lots of countries have graduated from development assistance or from IDA. But not only that, more than 30 countries have gone from being among the least developed countries to being middle income countries. Wow, that's a huge difference. Think about some of the countries we knew as the poorest in the world. When we grew up, some of them are now, they have challenges, but they are also typically middle income countries with big middle classes. And one last example, people often talk about aid dependence as a big problem. With many of the countries that have gotten the most development assistance, get much less of it today. I'll use Tanzania as an example. No country in the world has had more development assistance from Norway. If you go back to 1990, almost a fourth of their national budget was from development assistance. Today, it's less than 4%. That's the opposite of aid dependence. It's that we have contributed to their growth. So my pickup lesson again, I'm building on what Alexia said, maybe adding one more thing. That is to find the right, or to strike the right balance between doing what's evidence-based and doing innovation. Of course, most of what we do should build on the big body of evidence we have, and should, to what's cost effective and actually working. But it's also worth understanding that what's proven today was once an experiment, right? So we also have to try out new things, new modalities, work with new issues coming on, and so on, and striking that balance. It's at least what we're trying to do in Norad, spend the big money on proven efforts, but also innovate.
No, I completely agree. So first of all, the trends you note are really striking. And I think it's important to remember because it really, I feel like there's often a lot of negativity around the development sector, but when you look at it, it's actually been extremely successful in many years. And I think of some of these big global health programs like PEPFAR and what they did to help control the HIV epidemic, reduce AIDS deaths, reduce transmission from mother to child. It's just pretty stunning. And I agree. Part of it comes from launching programs that we know are effective, but also thinking about big new ideas and piloting and testing and experimenting and being a little bit bold in terms of trying to innovate. And a combination of, you never need just one thing. It's always a combination of the two to really make things happen. But for all these wonderful things, there's still there's still a lot of debate, and so there's a growing skepticism of many people around the world about foreign aid and why should we be contributing and is it effective? Is it transparent? So I'm going to start with you, Alexia, about with all this skepticism, with concerns about inefficiency, lack of transparency. Is it all being used for political influence? What do you see as the most credible critiques of foreign aid?
No, thanks for that. And I think at the highest level, Rema, a critique is, this is perhaps my critique, and then I'll get to some of the other critiques, is the concept of development as something done onto a person or onto a country. It doesn't work that way. It's not, there's knowledge and money and power in one place that is then done onto another. It doesn't work that way. The solutions are actually often in the countries themselves, in the people who are trying to better their lives themselves. And then my second big point is around a critique that I would have is this concept of there can be no failure in development. And this is very much linked to the last point that Bård was making around innovation. There is no human endeavor that I know about that hasn't had failures. And actually, there's a reason why you talk to the leading big CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They often talk about failure as much as they talk about successes, because they had often many failures before they got to the big breakthrough and success. Our space program is an example of that, right? There's been amazing moments where we've seen amazing things happen and people walk on the moon, and there's been a real tragedy where we've lost people involved in space programs. So I think those would be my personal two biggest points. It's not done onto others, and we've got to accept failure, but we've got to learn from failure and iterate fast. Okay, then let me offer perhaps a framework to think about critiquing international assistance, because oftentimes when people say, does it work, does it not work? It's like, what is the it? We're talking about different things sometimes. So I would say first, this is an institutional level. The institutions that deliver the assistance, are they functioning well as institutions? Do they deliver the aid well? So that's, an area where there should be ongoing critique about how to improve that. And I was involved in work years ago with the UK, actually, where we tried to look at what does it take for a development agency to be effective. And we looked at things like accountability, staff capacity, knowledge management. Do they have the right instruments, and do they have strategic clarity about what they're trying to do? The second level is the country, the recipient country itself. Is the political will there? Are the priorities clear? Is there commitment to reforms and transparency? There's a host of issues around recipient countries, and their MCC that you mentioned that I worked at, has three main areas that they look at to try and assess this. So they look at economic freedoms. What is the country's fiscal policies? How is the country's trade policy, regulatory regime? It looks at ruling justly. So what is the country's political liberties, civil rights, control of corruption? And then it looks at investing in people. Is that country prioritizing investing in its own people? And you can look at education expenditures, you can look at health expenditures, immunizations, for example. And then a third area would be around just prioritization. Are we clear about what we're spending money on, and are we spending money on the right things? Is, definitely an area to look at. And then the fourth and final one, because again, as Bård said, there's, the huge progress we've seen in the world being a less brutal place was due to lots of things and lots of different types of financing flows and other innovations, including technology. And so the question of, are we using the right type of financing for the right purposes? Because different types of financing have different uses, and are we matching that? So when I think about critiquing aid, which by the way, I think this is an industry that has been able to be quite self-critical. There's lots of ink, from Easterly to Sachs to Duflo and Banerjee. I think that's a good thing. I would look at the institutional level, the country level, the prioritization, like what are we spending money on, and then matching flow to use.
No, thanks. That's a lot to think about. I'm gonna, add as somebody who works a lot working with different country governments and aid agencies and international organizations on evaluation. I often see how disappointed people are when the evaluation shows no impact. But we actually learned a lot from that. And if we don't find no impact, it goes back to Bård's point before, then we're not innovating enough. We're not taking risks, trying out new ideas and seeing what could work or not work. And so failure is in many ways is an avenue for success.
I'm sorry, can I say something
Yeah,
that might be
yeah.
heresy?
Yeah.
Because I think accountability, and I mentioned it earlier, is so important.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
actually believe that there are some
Mhm.
very, very important things in the work of development that are very, very hard. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Let me
Mhm.
turn it
Yeah.
off. There's some very important things that are very hard, and perhaps some of the most important things,
Yeah.
very hard to measure.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things that are very easy to measure that actually don't matter very much. And
Yeah.
so we need accountability, but I think we can't have the tyranny of, is there the perfect indicator? Accountability is more than that.
I agree. And then it's also about timing. Oftentimes, at least for me, like for example, I've worked with the MCC where there's very strict deadlines around the funding cycles, but oftentimes the results you see, you're planning for long-term growth and the indicators are not going to even move for a while. So I do think it's about balancing a lot of these issues. And as we think about accountability, it's not just about saying everything is wrong or not that, but really learning from the data to think about how to improve and what things can mean and what long-term results can look like and so forth. But speaking of all of this issues around evidence-based, I know, Bård, you in a recent op-ed really talked about this, that you've argued that AIDS needs to be far more evidence-driven and impact-focused. Can you share your thoughts about what's missing in the current system?
Absolutely, and I think it's worth dividing between criticisms of aid, which is about how do we do it, how it can become more effective, and so on, and the more political discussion of which place does it have in this world and so on. So let me kind of start with the first one, which is more the discussion within the system. And my view is that probably we have not been good enough to systematically work to strengthen the interventions and spend more resources on the things that actually work and less on the things that show up to be not working at all or with limited effect. And today we have a quite big base of evidence in many fields of development assistance. Not all, for sure. Some things are very hard to measure. Some things are newer than other things, but I would say broadly, we know more than we think. Or if you take the total global base of evidence available. But and there's also one important thing here, which is a difference, or where aid is different from many other issues. I worked in politics, like you said, with other issues, whether it be transport or energy, other things. What's striking with development assistance is the huge difference in cost effectiveness between the best interventions and the worst. It's extremely big difference compared to if you do analysis of different, let's say, infrastructure projects or anything else. So actually doing the things that work is extremely important in terms of spending our resources well. And my impression is that working with many institutions like Norad across, and also it's about ourselves also, is that this isn't embedded well enough in the institutions. We haven't created these systems. And I think for different reasons, but one important reason is probably the very strong politicization of development assistance and the quite strict regulations on how to spend money on which kinds of thematic issues, for instance. I think that has been a challenge for USAID. It's my clear impression after working with them, but also for many European agencies. So doing more of that, but also communicating more clearly about this, because often in the public debate, at least in Europe, development assistance has tended, to be presented based on a moral argument. It's something we should do. It's the right thing. We're helping others. That moral argument is extremely important. but we have not paid attention to the effective, the efficiency and the effectivity argument. Many of the interventions are among the most effective things you can spend your resources on. And also when it comes to global public goods, it's good for others, but it's also very good for ourselves, like pandemic preparedness, climate, and so on. So it's a bit of a change in the narrative. Just to pick up one other, criticism or thing I think is extremely important, which is not about evidence and knowledge. That's of course the huge change in the world since development assistance was established. That was a time when it gave, it was meaningful to speak of developing and developed countries. That's not really meaningful. It's like, I once heard the Swedish, now late Professor Hans Rosling say that speaking about developed countries was like speaking about red and white wine. You kind of miss the nuances. And today it doesn't really make sense, but still a lot of the architecture is built around that. So this is also about how we do partnerships, building more equal partnerships. But of course, it's also about, how we find a different structure where we can finance all the needs we have in common globally. It's a much bigger challenge, but extremely important to talk about, not least in the situation, the dramatic situation we are now in geopolitically.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I get very frustrated when, in many ways, I'm a development economist, but I work on middle income countries and I help middle income countries use their resources more effectively to combat poverty, to improve health. So it's a very different kind of, what I actually do is a very different notion than development of what we thought about when it was 20 years ago when the world looked very different. And so maybe the terminology we're using, maybe the way we're conceptually presenting what we do and what is needed is just very outdated. And we, take some responsibility for the fact that we haven't really communicated well what aid looks like and what it can do and what it means. But I guess I wanted to also pick up something else you said, Bård, about that when we think about aid, we think of it as a moral imperative, but we also think of it as it's good for us too. And it's about the geopolitics of the situation. And so I wanted to ask, are we seeing, and I'm going to start with you, given that you raised this issue, are we seeing aid becoming more of a geopolitical tool rather than just thinking about being purely development focused? Does it affect the effectiveness of the aid projects that we do? And as we think more about the politics than just about development?
I think that's happening now, and it's two-faced, because on the one side, I think we can see that development of assistance grew more effective after the Cold War because it was less influenced by the direct interests of many of the donors. And that has been a big advantage, of course. To a larger degree, you could take that out of the equation and actually spend resources on the things that had the effect in the places where it was most needed. Now it is, of course, it's clearly, being politicized again. It's becoming a bigger part of geopolitics, of security policy. I think it's unavoidable that happens. But I think what we can hope to do is that we get a situation where the goals are, become more political, but the interventions, the means, still are more knowledge-based. I think that should be possible. And there's also a second debate I think will be really important now, and that is, I of course fear, because of the fiscal situation in many European countries, for instance, there will be a very tough pressure on development assistance. We're already seeing that happening, just the last few weeks in the UK, but before that with big cuts in some other countries, the Netherlands, Switzerland, partly Sweden, and so on. But if you turn it around, I think, what Europe and I would say North America also needs more now than in a long time is to build alliances with the global South. It can hardly be a good situation for Europe and North America now if we get a world where China and Russia play a bigger part, get new alliances in the global south, and there's a real risk of that happening if we see big cuts in development assistance. I think it's also extremely important to understand that development assistance can be a huge investment in many of the security threats of the future. So climate change is a huge security threat. And a loss of biodiversity also. The World Economic Forum has these on top of their long-term security threats per year, and of course pandemics, like we know. So I think it also challenges us to adjust our narrative, to understand that it will be part of the debate, but also argue how important it can be to keep the world together, to build alliances, and also at the same time argue that on the intervention level, we have to be knowledge-based because we get more effect out of each dollar or each Norwegian krone.
No, I completely agree. It's thinking about the broader rationale and what we're doing in terms of the broader political situation, and also then making sure that we have technical solutions at work. And this is something that, when we stress, when we, in a lot of our policy, I just connecting it back to our students, I know many who are, might be on the Zoom link today, when we're stressing what is effective policy, we talk about not just you want to get the technical solution because you want it to be effective, but you also want to be thinking about the politics. You want to think about what you can implement with the resources you have. And it's all these things that come together to determine the ultimate policy. And so I think it's a really important point you're making that I think is very relevant for a lot of our classroom debates as well. Alexia, I want to turn over the same question to you as well, thinking about the intersection between the politics and the technical side.
No, thank you. And I agree with much of what's been said, so I'll be brief, but I will sort of posit that I think the concept of pure development is a bit of a misnomer. I think development is inherently political. And I think that's true for both recipient countries that are, trying to develop themselves, as well as for the donors that are investing in development. I think it's inherently political. We talk about the importance of understanding the political economy if we're going to try and have successful interventions. That's why. So I think the key is to not have short political cycles and the tyranny of lots of small interests sort of impeding the technical effectiveness of development. I think we should be much more honest about the political nature of development. And then I think we need to then think about, where is the matchmaking between the goals that both countries that we're investing in have, and then what the donor countries are working on. And by the way, I think the Sustainable Development Goals, which obviously, there was lots coming out from my country on the SDGs recently, were, I think, an attempt to have a universal articulation of development priorities, and there's a lot of, criticisms about the 169 targets, but I think the 17 goals at the higher level do create, I think, a universal agenda that is cohesive across, investing countries and recipient countries. And I think focusing on those higher level goals and keeping that big picture agenda in mind is really important, and creating guardrails against micro political, short-term, narrowly self-interested decisions is, I think, what we're facing right now in ways that are pretty dramatic, and that I think we need to really fight against, in my view.
No, I completely agree. And just to, there's the politics of the donor countries and their cycles and when things change and not change, but it's also then it's a co-creation. Like aid is not just it plops down, it's a co-creation. And then there's the political cycles within countries as well. And when these two intersect, it does often end up with a lot of not so much long-term planning that might be detrimental as we're thinking about development, not just as a process, and as a process that it does take time and it takes a long-term investment and strategy. And so I completely agree that we need to be really thinking about these and trying to think about ways to safeguard, and the end of the day, aid is inherently political, but also to safeguard some of the aspects that we think about in terms of thinking about long-term policy planning. But I want to then, turn it over again. Sorry, I'm keeping us on track. I'm going to ask, I think, one more question, and then I'll try to open it up to the audience as well. I already see that there is a lot of questions coming about. But, given the shocks we've seen both in the US, in the last, with the UK, with France, with Germany, Sweden, and so forth as well, there's a lot of debate about who should be funding international aid assistance. Even this morning in the newspaper and the FT, Duflo and Banerjee had an op-ed about how, given all of this, the private sector needs to step up. So this is my question. Should we be looking at new actors? Emerging economies, a lot of countries have, developed and graduated off of assistance. Should they be contributing more? Should we be thinking about the private sector as a sustainable partner, or is that also then going to be based on the whims of the private sectors and cycles there? How should we be thinking about development financing given all these shocks? And I'm going to start with you, Bård.
Thanks. Great and really, essential question. In the world we are, because the strange situation now is, of course, that the needs are actually growing. So, for instance, humanitarian needs, as measured by UN appeals, is about doubled in 5 years, right? And the number of refugees in the world. And then you have new big challenges like climate and so on. Well, of course, development assistance is being reduced, as we speak. I think so. Let me answer in 3 points. So first, I think that we know that it's not very realistic to see an increase in official development assistance or public money, but a lot of what we are going to fund is unrealistic to finance without public money, to be honest. So I think we will do a mistake if we say no, we can have new donors and private sector money and so on. It's not realistic in the short run, and many of the most important and effective things, there's no private sector willingness or invest a project with an investment plan or with profits there. Humanitarian support in Sudan or Gaza or wherever will have to be financed by states. And I think also a lot of what we have been talking about in the human capital sphere, it's the same thing. So we have to understand, in my view, in this century, that financing international big, huge pushes has to remain a public effort. And we just had to kind of figure out and discuss, are we willing to do a little more of that together? So that's my first point. And second is, and I already alluded to it or mentioned it, of course, the donor landscape has to change also. I can't see, for instance, a world where we are able to reach even close to our climate goals. In Baku, most countries agreed on a new financing goal of $300 billion. So that's a lot more than all official development assistance today, right? It's not possible to imagine without more countries stepping up. So that will be a very difficult conversation, but it's necessary. And the third point is private sector engagement, where private sector engagement is realistic. So today, the truth is that, if you took the rhetoric, you would think that, this is a big thing happening in the world. The empirical evidence is that we don't have enough effect of what we're doing from the public side, and it's not that big. For instance, it's only 20% of the total in climate finance. But on issues like energy, food security, some other issues, it's easy to see that the private sector could find huge investment possibilities. And I think the key obstacle is risk, basically. Because often, the profit could be high for an investment, but the risk is even higher. And what we believe in most from Norad side now is guarantees. Partly also because, you know, we're a country with a very strong capital base. We have a AAA rating. Some countries have, you know, and using instruments where we're not spending money. The point is actually to not spend money, but to guarantee. That's one of the things we really believe in scaling up, and then doing innovation on the private sector engagement, where we also measure, do the research, stop doing the things that doesn't work, but go on with the things that, you know, the things that are promising, is also an extremely important track.
No, thank you, Alexia. Do you have something to add as well?
Yes, Rema. So first of all, I would say let's avoid the pendulum swings that development loves. Okay, so it's not all private sector, all ODA, all grants, all, you know, leveraged instruments. That's a disaster. Number two, we actually know a lot about what's needed. If you look at Financing for Development 2015, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is now, you know, it's going to be rediscussed in Seville in June. We need all kinds of flows. We absolutely need ODA for certain purposes, and Bård, you talked about that very eloquently. We need countries' own domestic resources, and the domestic resource mobilization agenda is not new, but some old things need persistent, continued attention to get right. And by the way, that gives countries, we talked about aid dependency originally, you know, a little earlier on, that gives countries the most agencies over their resources, domestic resource mobilizations, and we absolutely need the private sector as well. In addition to these three funding flows, and we talked about this back in 2015, we need innovation, we need policy, smart policies, and we need technology. So we need all of the above. That's my second point, and we know that already. There's a lot of work that's been done in thinking about this. But the challenge in front of us is how to get these flows not only just all flowing, but flowing in a way where they help each other and they unlock each other in the smart ways, right? So how does ODA and how does public finance, how do you use that smartly to create the conditions that can get more private capital to come in, for example? So yes, risk is important and de-risking is important. And there's a host of instruments we can look at. We can look at guarantees, we can look at blended finance, we can look at insurance. And actually there's a lot more focus now on insurance, but it's also about using public finance to create that policy certainty, which by the way, most private investors raise that as the first challenge, you know, political and policy certainty. We need data because these are markets that a lot of the private capital just don't know. Like they just don't know these countries. And so data through the Global Emerging Markets Risk Database that actually shows recovery and default rates in emerging markets could bring comfort to investors about markets that they frankly don't really know or understand as well. And of course, you need projects that are bankable, that are well structured. So it's not just an idea of a project, but they're well structured. The developers are there, the project managers are there, and the capital allocators are there. And so Bård talked about the Baku finance goal, the 300 billion for climate. That's the inner goal. There's a much larger goal in the trillions, but you're never going to get to that trillions goal if you don't use the 300 billion in a way that seeks to attract that broader goal. So I think it's the interaction. You talked about partnerships earlier, Bård. I think that's where, you know, really a lot of the magic will be. In addition, of course, to getting more countries to contribute. You know, that's been a longstanding agenda, for example, for the United States to say, look, we look at China and its level of development. It should be a stronger contributor to international assistance as well. My final point is that we have shown that there can be innovations that stretch money responsibly. So for example, in the development banks, the multilateral development banks, we've been able to see that we can use their balance sheets. We've been perhaps too conservative. We can stretch their balance sheets responsibly. They maintain their AAAs and creating more lending headroom. With the climate investment funds, you know, they were able to, with guarantees that many countries provided, including some of us here on this call, We were able to, the climate investment funds were able to use years of the funding that it had received to do a bond issuance that was oversubscribed, $500 million. And that's, again, creating more leverage in the system. So I think there's ways to be innovative about how we finance. The United States, for example, for the first time, started providing guarantees to the development banks, again, to create more leverage. The UK was a leader in this area. I will just do the final point, which is not everything can be leveraged. So we need to think about more innovative financing mechanisms. We need to leverage, but you still need a foundation of that grant funding against which to leverage. So again, nothing in the extreme.
No, this is great. And there's so much I would love to follow up on, but we have like 15 minutes and I want to get to, there's some really great questions from the audience I want to get to. One of them follows up exactly on what you're talking about. We want cooperation. We want many people participating, but what if we don't agree on the goals? And so, for example, we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals as an attempt to have a language around values and what we're aiming for. But how do you get people to cooperate around these goals if, for example, there are many countries where even questioning whether or not climate change isn't actually a thing, and whether or not it's affecting the planet? So how do you get people to come together and cooperate when we're not actually agreeing on what those goals are? And so I don't know who wants to start, but I'm happy to open it up.
So I don't know if I exactly understood the question,
Yeah.
but so Rema, try again, and I can have a go.
So you want to get lots of different countries to agree. So you talked about climate change and why it's really important, and we don't have enough financing to address the scope of the scale of the problem. But there are a lot of countries out there that are even questioning whether or not climate change exists. And so then how do you get people on board to address these global challenges when we don't have a shared understanding of what the problems are and what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve?
I mean, Bård, maybe I can give you.
Yeah, sure. Come on.
Maybe I can jump, because I think that's a really critical question. And, actually, we've sort of lived through that question through those countries that are shareholders of the World Bank, but also some of the other regional development banks recently, where there was a really big effort to evolve the development banks to meet some of these big global challenges, including climate, but also pandemic and health security, and also fragility and conflict. And frankly, it sparked really, really frank discussion at the boards of these countries that are owned, by 174 countries. Like, all the countries are there, and there were fault lines that really were exposed. But there was a real discussion about the fault lines. And that's my point, is we need to tackle those differences head on. And at the end of the day, through very, 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 very difficult conversations, there was common ground found. So, for example, there was common ground found. Now, of course, there's a new dynamic now with the US, but there was common ground found that actually you need a sustainable planet, and you need to not deplete natural resources, and pollution is a bad thing, and you do need a low carbon economy. There was actually agreement on that, and that you can't actually have sustained progress on poverty reduction and economic growth without tackling that. There was actually agreement at the World Bank Board, which again is the broadest, of development institutions on this. There are lots of disagreements on how to. So, for example, the role of natural gas, versus only wind and solar, etc. So there are fault lines, but I'm not trying to be Pollyannish here, but I think the key is to actually have frank, transparent debates, including on the hardest topics, in a civilized way, ideally with evidence in the room as well, and then to make good old-fashioned compromise. Can be a bad word, but can also be a good word, to find the Venn diagram of common ground. And there is the possibility for more common ground than we think. That's being challenged right now, but I still believe in what I just said.
Just to add to that, Riemann, the reason I was a bit reluctant was I was thinking, welcome to the world. That's the way the world is. I used to work a lot with climate change. I kind of still do, but I was a minister of environment and negotiating on the COPs and so on. and your task was to agree with 200 others, some who believe in climate change, some who don't, some who want to go further, some who do everything they can to stop this, stop agreement. And that's the world. It's not a very effective place, but it's the world we have. And I think also that one of the things that have emerged the last 15, 20 years also, because there is of course that you have layers, right? You have the UN agencies and conference zone where everyone is. Then you have G20, right? G8, other bodies, the African Union, the EU, and so on. And then you also have alliances, which are more specific clubs and so on, which has created probably a world with a bigger ability to move on, but also an even more complex world. So my main worry today is that from a situation where quite a few of the most important countries and blocks of countries like the US, the EU, China, some others were able to agree to a certain degree on important things. Like we were able to agree enough to move climate ahead, to move global health ahead. We might be a place now where they're not actually able to agree. And if some of the most important players are not interested or are not able to agree, then that's what worries me now. Then we just can't move ahead.
It worries me as well. I do think going back to this point of, as we, there's a lot of criticism about the Sustainable Development Goals, but that was an attempt to try to come together as a global community and define a set of values, a set of facts, a set of aspirations of what we wanted to make the world a better place. And if we don't agree on these kind of things anymore, how do we continue to have these conversations? What does it mean? I think these are real challenges as we move forward. But I would love to talk more about that, but I see so many questions. So I have a next one for you, Alexia. I'm going to try to condense your question for the interest of time, but it's about the MCC model. So for those of you in the audience who don't know, so the MCC is an arm of the US government that aims to work with probably more like lower middle income countries with a lot of political stability, to try to improve business development growth in markets. And so for example, I worked as part of an MCC team in Morocco as evaluator of some of the programs and projects and such. But the question from the audience is, if that's the model today, that we're looking at working in these stable countries, working on business growth and development, what about humanitarian? What about human capital development? What about is there the most potential for bigger impacts in countries that are much poorer and not middle income because they have so much more to grow and catch up? How do we think about the trade-off between working on business development versus working on some of these human capital issues in more lower income countries?
I think you talked about development as a process, Rema. So every country, including the United States, is still in a process of development. You're just somewhere different on the line plot. And luckily, the United States, like many other countries, have a rather extensive, and I hope that continues, even though it's being challenged right now, toolbox to work on development, right? That includes bilateral and its contributions to the multilateral. And not every part of the system, of the aid architecture, needs to do everything. So I think, humanitarian, and by the way, in the humanitarian development, is a continuum. It's not like one is there and the other is there, right? It's a continuum. But you absolutely need to work in the most fragile countries. Actually, that's fragility is increasing. We're going to see poverty increasingly concentrated in countries or parts of countries affected by fragility and conflict. And so you absolutely need international assistance to be there. And the question is, who are the best players, the best institutions, the best partnerships to do that, right? So that's great. It doesn't mean that every part of the system needs to do that. So, as you said rightfully, and I think I alluded to earlier, MCC does work in countries that have made some of their own investments on economic freedoms, ruling justly, and investing in their own people. I would never say that all of international assistance needs to be defined by that paradigm. I think it's a very effective paradigm to particularly address the most stubborn constraints to economic growth. But again, we don't need one answer for everything. We have a system that needs to deliver on multiple objectives, ideally objectives that are more clearly defined and not in the thousands. I think that's part of our communication challenge. So what I would say is I think MCC serves a certain part of and addresses a certain part of the challenge. I think it's good to have some specialization. That's okay. And obviously assistance and humanitarian assistance remains, really important to do well. And then the idea is if we can get the humanitarian to development continuum to work better, that would be another, area for investment and growth, I think.
Right. No, and I want to follow up on that communication issues, because it relates to another question from the audience I want to throw over to you, Bård. This idea that, as we're humanitarian, it's gotten a bad name in recent weeks. But we think it's so important for global stability. We think it's also from a values point of view. I think it's very important as we try to think about making sure that everybody has access to safety, everyone has access to food, to basic healthcare. How would you try to convince when there's a lot of skepticism about humanitarian aid? How would you try to convince people of its importance and why it can also benefit them, benefit somebody in Kansas who's wondering why USAID is sending money to Sudan and Gaza? How does it also benefit them?
A great question. The strange thing is that I think there might be a divide here between the US and Europe, actually, because my experience at least in Northern Europe, is that many people can be skeptical to development efforts, but humanitarian, that's like, okay, so we just have to save lives, right? We should do that. That's my experience, that instinct of just helping, and we're neutral, and we're just helping those who need it. That's pretty strong. Of course, there's they wouldn't spend everything on that, but it's we have polling showing, for instance, it's easier to get support for humanitarian than development efforts. But of course, to a certain level, and we and many others know that they are strongly interlinked. And to do good humanitarian work, you should do it in resilient ways and keep up for some years, so you can create real development. But to your interest, I would say first, many of the things we do in development are things that are good for us also. We can't stop a new pandemic on ourselves. We can't stop climate change on ourselves, rather the opposite. Many of the most effective and best things to do for ourselves are things where we're spending the money in other countries, because that helps us as well. And second, a stable world is a safer world for us than an unstable world. And in Europe, we have regions around us now that are very unstable, with wars and conflicts. And if we can contribute to, with humanitarian resources, to make the conflicts less violent, less, growing and so on, it's good for us as well.
No, I personally agree with you, and I'm glad to see that there's a lot of support, particularly in Europe, around humanitarian aid. I hate to do this because it's such a great conversation, and I would love to be able to keep that conversation going, but I think we've hit the end of our time together. So I wanted to thank you both for an amazing discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope we can continue to keep this conversation moving forward in the future. Thank you to everyone in the audience. I know everybody is so busy and life is very stressful, and so it's nice that you're joining to really participate and to learn and to be part of the conversation. So I do I think I've been told by the powers that be, I should remind everybody of two things. Please do complete the survey to share your perspective. It helps us think about programming in the future. And we will continue our next session actually with a theme that is very relevant to what we're just discussing right now on Monday, with the theme of humanitarian responses with foreign aid and USAID. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And thank you to our amazing panelists.